Thank you very much, both Roberto and Emilio, for putting together such a wonderful gathering and inviting me to participate in this. And you've already said this, but perhaps we can have another occasion. We can actually meet in person and share our discussions. But thank you so much again. Yes, my talk is concerning a new project on vocations that's following the last one on the knowing by heart. We have long been concerned, both experientially and philosophically, with a set of issues that can loosely be grouped under the experiential questions like who am I, what is my place in the world, and related questions like who am I to become, what is my purpose, does my life have meaning? Philosophical questions concerning the constitution of subjectivity, personal identity, the narrative self, etc., I think all have a purchase here. And these questions are rooted in the deeper problem of vocational experience. In my view, without tackling the problem of vocation, we're working in a severely diminished capacity because the matter of vocation, or vocations, coincide with our very being. It concerns the problem of individuation, namely the style of an individual and interpersonal existence as radically unique in each and every case. Ultimately, vocational experience is grounded in loving as a dynamic interpersonal movement. Not only do we learn experientially that the individual cannot manage vocational experience all alone, but structurally there are emotions peculiar to human experience, ranging from pride to humility, that point us in this direction, namely of not being self-grounded. So this paper that concerns vocation or vocational experiences requires an investigation in our modes or our access to them. This is a potentially difficult issue. If there were only one kind of givenness, like let's say a rational epistemic one, then the only kind of access to this experience would be a kind of rational adjudication. But vocational experience does not admit of such an adjudication, and therefore would become relegated to queries of psychological introspection, or it would become the subject of blind belief. But as I have tried to show in earlier works, the human person is not exhausted in the dualism of reason and sensibility. There's what I call a schema of the heart with its own kinds of cognition. This is peculiar also to Pascal, Shaler, and others. And they are different from what can be called a presentation or presentational givenness. This means that we can already suspect a different kind of access peculiar to the experience of vocations than what traditional philosophical or even phenomenological account might yield. The context in which I describe vocational experience is a philosophical anthropology that I highlighted in a recent work that Roberto mentioned, Knowing by Heart. So I'd like to just enumerate and summarize some of these more prominent features that serves as a preface to the problem field of vocational experience that I want to just highlight here. So first of all, evidence of the heart. And these are just main characteristics, I think, that are they're not exhaustive, but they're serve as a background, or like I say, a preface to approach the problem of vocation. So first, evidence of the heart. The mode of knowing related to vocational experiences, and this includes a self-knowing or even knowing myself, capital M, myself, is not restricted to a rational cognition and is not subject to a reason-sensibility dualism. Rather, there's an emotional cognition, which I call a knowing by heart. Secondly, loving and hating. Our access to vocational experience is most profoundly through loving. Loving is a feeling, or more precisely, an act movement, which is irreducible to a feeling state. Loving, so not just in case of loving, but all of these emotions, we can just describe a feeling and then a feeling state, and these have to be kept distinct. So loving includes both a self-love and love of another. Alternately, the denial of another in the form of obstructing vocational experience takes place most radically through hating. Hating is also an act movement and not a feeling state, and can emerge as an event hating that occurs personally, individually, or a structural hating, so an institutional hating that might permeate relations over time, such as racism and misogyny and the like. Both loving and hating occur at the core of personhood. Thirdly, a philosophical anthropology and the beloved. The philosophical anthropology that I advanced in knowing by heart begins from the phenomenological position of the beloved. The beloved as a starting point for phenomenology is basically what they call the personal beloved. So schematically speaking, it's possible to say that all creation is beloved, so that first and foremost, we're not creatures or creation, but beloveds. All beloveds, or creation, all beloveds are loved into being. For something to be given as beloved, it's already moving within that openness of loving, such that the evidence of the beloved is only given within that movement. Thus, beloved is another term for what is primordially given through loving, whether that beloved be inanimate or organic, psychophysical, spiritual, personal, and so on. Those beloveds who love are constituted as persons. Persons are not in principle restricted to human beings. Rather, personhood can be revealed through any species precisely as beloveds who love. To express it another way, all reality, all that is expressive of loving. And I don't mean by loving a sentiment, and I don't mean it by feeling happy or anything like that, but as a movement toward, or an opening toward, if we want to use that orientation sense, although it's a little deceptive, as allowing all these to flourish in their own way as bearers of value. There are many ways in which loving is present as beloveds, from strings and quarks and elements, dust clouds, nebula, minerals, crystals, energy, simplest forms of single cell life, psychophysical beings, to being personally present in the peculiar way of loving in relation to those who have creatively become susceptible to such a vertical revelation, and where each element is susceptible in its own way to meaning and value for those who perceive and receive them in their distinctive ways of givenness. Although all creation is in the first instance beloved, those beloveds who love, as I mentioned, are constituted as person. The phenomenological perspective for such a description of an anthropology and phenomenon of vocation begins from a so-called first-person perspective of the beloved. In order to describe vocational experience, it's important to note that loving, as from another, is how I'm given to myself. I receive myself. I'm first and foremost constituted or given to myself in and through loving as beloved. This means in part that the so-called first person is the second person, and the so-called second person is primordial where vocational experience is concerned. And this already begins to disrupt our traditional understanding of what we mean by first and second person perspectives. The main point is that when we find ourselves, as it were, we take ourselves up already within this kind of generative loving. Structurally, not temporally, I find myself as beloved before I could have loved, as it were, structurally, not temporally. Through epiphany as loving, we are revealed to ourselves most fundamentally as beloved. Any other revealing act, movement, like shame or guilt or sympathy or repentance, points back in its own way or clarifies and disposes us to this fundamental revelation of loving and being loved. That was a long fourth point. They're shorter now. Fifth point, participating being. Loving is a movement of what I call participating being, not without the preposition. Epistemic cognition, like perception, is a process of participating in being. All beloveds are participated through loving, so infinite person. And to love is to participate all beings in their distinctive ways of being. Those beloveds in which loving becomes creatively revealed and realized as loving are revealed to others and to themselves in an ongoing process as person. In this way, finite persons are not reducible to the species human being. Knowing myself or knowing another personally means to participate my or their own being as beloved in and through loving. And this bears directly on becoming who we are in vocational experiences. Sixth point, discernment. Knowing who we are most fully, knowing who we are to become and what we are to do is a process of the mindful discernment of the heart, which has both historical and interpersonal dimensions. This is a distinctive form of critique, and it comes from the same discernment, same Greek root as we get from critique. Knowing myself by heart as beloved is a process of discerning who I am to become in a critical way, and who another is to become, and the way it is to be participated. 7, the vigilance of loving and loving as vigilance. Loving is characterized in part by a vigilance. This is an ongoing, persistent incitement to love and to be loved. There is a normative dimension to loving evident in the vigilance of loving. It pertains to all value ranges of the beloved, and where the person is concerned, it pertains to the beloved as absolute value. If this loving is in any way felt, there is a demand, as it were, to love and to be loved or to refuse it. There is accordingly an absolute ought, Husserl's expression, that pertains to who we are to be or to become. Metaphysically, this is received as a vocation to be loved. In terms of the uniqueness of the person, it's received in terms of the ways in which I am to be loving. In neither case is there a neutral givenness, but a charged revelation, as it were, no matter how dimly or brightly evident. Corresponding to the temporality of the vigilance of loving, there's a temporality of urgency with respect to vocational experience. The normative dimension is interpersonal, and interpersonally it founds following norms and the turning from norms. And this is in part linked to the phenomenon of exemplarity that I don't go into. 8th point, secular humanism and the normativity in loving. Secular humanism is not sufficient to determine or to discern vocational experience. Human dignity, which is of fundamental significance, is founded in the sacredness of the person. Hence, the ontological vocation to become more fully human, like Freire expounds, is founded in the metaphysical vocation to be loved, something that we would find in like Gutierrez. Without the revelation of the person as interpersonal and as capital P personal, or put differently, without the other person as sacred, without any absolute given in human existential experience, any such openness or tolerance would be, as Camus rightly put it, absurd. To be revealed as person is to be revealed in the irreducible integrity and absolute value of who the person is as person. The foundation or way of that givenness is most radically loving. And then the 9th point, loving in vocations. The matter of vocations is a matter of genuine love of another and genuine self-love, and the genuine possibility of self-betrayal or self-hating or hatred of the other as an act movement of hating, as I mentioned, as an event hating or as a structural hating. Hence, the problem of vocations is founded in the movements of loving and hating as movements of the heart, with their own kinds of evidence, cognitions, knowings, modalities, modalizations, and temporalities. With this initial background now, which I just very quickly sketched, I want to turn more explicitly to the phenomenon of vocations. So even though we live this mystery of the beloved through our social, political, economic, ecological practices, it's fundamentally impossible to address vocational experience from the perspective, as I mentioned, from a secular humanism. Vocational experience as such, which is both personal and interpersonal, can only be grasped through the vertical givenness of epiphany or revelation, which is to say from religious and ethical or moral dimensions of experience. So I want to list or try to explicate here a few points that I think are characteristic of vocational experience within this context. So first of all, I should have 5 that I'll be able to have time for. First is what I call appointment and incitement. While I do, and in fact must appropriate the vocation as such, in order for it to be constituted as vocation, I cannot appoint a vocational experience to myself. Instead, I receive a vocation as an incitement, as from another. If it were merely an appointment, there would be no freedom or sense of creative reception. I receive it, but I cannot appoint it to myself. This occurs within the context of what I've called, what I mentioned above as the vigilance of loving. Furthermore, while it's interpersonal, I cannot appoint a vocation or vocational experience to another as vocation. For example, I can't simply say to another, you're a musician or you're a mechanic. However, we should not confuse the inability to appoint a vocation, which has to do with the very nature of vocation, with the possibility of somebody having an insight into me, and in this case, or from me to another. And such an insight would have to be founded most profoundly in an openness to who the other person is in a dynamic sense. If it is not an appointment, what can we call the vocational experience? Not only do we have the experience of something coming to me as I find myself, but a sense of freedom in appropriating it too. This is why if we want to use the term a call, we would have to characterize one moment of it as this incitement, which might be experienced as compelling, as an absolute ought, but not as being compelled or forced as a duty. Not given as an arbitrary nomination, vocational experience does, however, suggest a beyond or transcendence in which I receive myself in loving to be loved. That's the metaphysical sense. In these or those ways, and that's a particular unique sense of distinction, maybe one could say, between a calling and callings, something like that. As an absolute ought that does not come from me alone, it is enjoined by experience of a weight that is not a weight of a necessity, a duty, or an obligation. This is why we need to refigure what we mean by modalities, because, well, I'll mention that in the next point. Temporally speaking, it comes with an urgency that's not the same as having to get something done by a particular time. It always has to be done, and it's always being done. The future is experienced as present, and it's irrelevant whether or if there are others enjoined in a similar way. Ultimately, it cannot be postponed to another time or conceded to others if I experience that as vocation. That's the first point. Second point, the modality of absolute ought. In another work relying primarily on Edmund Husserl, I attempted to give an initial count of the distinctive modality of vocational experience, because the latter cannot be accommodated by traditional senses of modality, as they're restricted epistemically in some cases to necessity, contingency, possibility, impossibility, the actual and non-actual, etc. For Shaler and for Husserl, the problem of vocation is related to the problem of evidence. Namely, how am I given to myself, and how are others given to me in a personal manner? And for Husserl, it's centered around 4 main intertwining notions, what he calls the ought, the absolute ought, the call, well, and loving. There's another one, the person that he identifies here with loving, similar to Shaler. The absolute ought is given through a calling, where most profoundly the calling and the reception of it are qualified through loving. Shaler calls this the good in itself for me. Husserl offers many examples of the ought, not all of which are the same. There is a praxical ought, there is an absolute ought, There's also a kind of practical ought. The point here is that the sense of vocation would require an explication of two kinds of revelatory givenness. So I know I just slipped in those terms. When I use a term like epiphany, is the term I use from a religious givenness, and then revelation, an interpersonal, a moral interpersonal, human and finite interpersonal. So when I speak of, I'm just trying to use different words instead of a neutral givenness that would belong to a kind of a verticality, as I call it in another work. But revelation belongs, there's two kinds, a self being like a self-revelatory givenness, let's say, and then a being revelatory of the other person. And these correspond to a vocational experience on the one hand, and an exemplar and being an exemplar, or an experience of an exemplar in the other case. The third point, receiving and response. A vocation is only experienced as vocation when it is received in some way. Receiving is not a passive process, but an implicit activity, a reception that presupposes an openness. Whereas I could go to an institution of higher learning to hone in on a trade or a profession, I cannot learn a vocation in the same way. We might discover or perhaps elicit a vocation through this process, but the vocational experience, enduring as it is, cannot be identified with going through a course of study by rote to come out at the end of it with a sign of accomplishment. Thus, the other moment of vocational experience is the free reception of an incitement that makes it a vocational experience as such. At the most basic level, this is a receiving of myself as myself, and most deeply a creative receiving of myself as beloved. It is on the basis of receiving that we can inquire after the dimension of response. Because vocational experience is constituted through an incitement as from another, it is possible to receive it, and in the process of receiving, reject, affirm, or modify it. Negating it in full awareness of the reception is possible, but to my mind, it might occur at great personal cost once experienced. Or it could occur as a creative transformation, provided that one remains open. All of this, of course, presupposes the person as free and in a multivalent sense of freedom, not as autonomy, but as creative, spontaneous, or also even freedom as being bound to another. Where receiving is concerned, the process of reception does not follow the calling, but completes it, constitutes it as vocational experience. In terms of the response, there is a possibility of rejecting it, giving it up, persisting in it, in a different line, affirming it, reaffirming it, and so on. Once something is lived as vocational experience, there is an incitement that elicits the vocational pursuit in the sense of deepening. There's a temporal intensifying in and through the frustrations. It is different from an appetite, a repetitive beginning-end process like we might find in the case of addiction. The historical situation, social structures, and the like can influence profoundly what possibilities and responsibilities and what knowledge and what self-knowledge is available. We can ask, what could distract us from the incited vocational pursuit, or what could contribute to the constructions of needs that would distract or keep us distracted from who we are? So Marx, is a great example in his analysis. There are other modal questions that we could ask given through particular examples. Would Kafka be who he was without his otherwise alienating conditions? Does one find one's way through struggle creatively? This example and these questions suggest that vocational experience is not a one-time event or even a unidirectional or a unilateral movement. It may be the case that I cannot respond adequately to a vocational experience due to socio-economic or political circumstances. I may become dull to sensing the very matter of vocational experience, and it may never even occur to me after a certain point. It may remain like a low buzz or humming throughout a lifetime, and something to which we are only passively aware, something we become practiced in ignoring, but not knowing we are ignoring it on an explicit level. And these may be due to an event hating or structural hating. The distracting desires that keep us from who we are, or at least pursuing who we are, can manifest themselves in a disordered heart. It's not always clear from the one experiencing just what is disordered, since we can live this disordered as ordered, such that the disorder is practically invisible. So what's the evidence given in vocational experience? I can only suggest here, or hint here, that we would have to examine levels of intensity, urgency, frustration, calm, peacefulness, oughtness, depth, freedom, compulsion, something being compelling, but not a compulsion. The difference between ought, duty, and obligation, or like I said, an overwhelming presence. We'd have to consider the temporality of these kinds of evidence. Are they enduring? Are they temporary? Are they fleeting? And we'd have to investigate kinds of bodily experiences like warmth, fire, coolness, sickness, health. Are they positive? Is there a revealing fever? I'm just thinking of Bergman and his example when he was 13. After he saw taken to see The Black Beauty by his aunt, he had a fever. Literally had a fever for 3 days, but then at 65 he says, this fever's never left me. There's some really interesting story about Bergman. Or on the contrary, are there ulcers, headaches, tension, all of these, either positive or negative, which can be given with vocational experiences or a disordered heart. And we'd have to ask even further, in what sense are they positive, negative, productive, constitutive, and so on? What kind of effects are associated with these experiences? Again, are they lasting or momentary? Are they confined by a lifetime? Or do they appear beyond a lifetime, generatively? Can we ever feel like we're being adequate in relationship to a vocation anyway? An adequate response. That's something different from a task. Okay, the fourth point, what I call here anointment. I don't have a better term. If anybody has a better term, that's great. I just take it from purposefully I take it from the Hebrew sense of messiah, because my point here is that it can't be, when we take it in its full sense, we can't have temporal limits on this experience, and we can't limit it arbitrarily. So when we speak of this revelation of myself as beloved and as not self-grounding, this is generative in relationship to, all that is. So there's this deeply interpersonal dimension, big P, dimension of this personal. There's also the ethical or moral interpersonal dimension of this experience. That not self-grounding character of the experience, where it's not lived as a neutral givenness, is wherein I find myself as toward this rather than that, and where the structure of that revealing is qualified through an opening to become, not as predestined, but as an originating where deeper possibilities might flash forth without them being predetermined. So we have that one not self-grounding dimension to anointment, but there's also, and as I mentioned, the finite interpersonal dimension that also comes with anointment, since it conveys an interpersonal responsibility, that dimension that's inherent in the vocational experience. And from this perspective is peculiar to all of us and all our possibilities. My suggestion here is that the interpersonally responsible dimension is peculiar to the structure of vocational experience, so for others, and not necessarily that we have this self-awareness in view at all or all times. Some may have this self-awareness, but in principle, it's open to all. So anointment is not an imposition that would go against others. but assumes a responsibility for them in becoming who I am, and by implication, who they are. In this way, the anointment dimension is oriented toward opening possibilities, or infinitizing them, or removing limitations, as opening up creatively the revelation of person. All senses of anointment that we gain from religions or cults are rooted in this interpersonal vocational sense, and not the reverse. It's something bestowed upon us and a responsibility toward others. Thus, I cannot appoint, just as I cannot appoint myself vocationally, I cannot anoint myself either, which would be rather fun. It must come from another, even if I take it up, and I have to take it up if it is to become this way. And this goes to the not self-grounding character of the experience. The experience of anointment is transformative when it's lived. While I can't not anoint myself, and while it comes from another, it can only become meaningful through my creative appropriation. My receiving and eventually appropriating response, whether it's positive or negative, also constitutes the anointment as such. My becoming is inherently linked to the becoming of others, as theirs is to mine, which is why the matter of vocational experience cannot be simply an individual matter. If we express this in the manner of the co-foundational and asymmetrical relation of home and alien, we can say that in vocational anointment, we live toward others from who we are as home, such that they can become who they are and not who we want them to be, in relation to those others who may even be outside of a vocational context for themselves. For example, in Zen Buddhism, we approach others, let's say we're in an Abrahamic context, so that they can become a better Zen Buddhist, even if they don't have a sense of vocation in that way. But it's not a matter of for them to become a better Jew, Christian, or Muslim. Thus, we go to the depths of who we are in approaching others in their difference or their uniqueness, I would say, and do not make them into the depths of who we are, but remain open to them so that they become who they are in the depths of who they can be. In this way, for example, the Jewish person, Christian or Muslim, meets a Zen Buddhist in his or her radical uniqueness. This basically would be called loving. This aspect of vocational anointment implies another, namely what I term vocational justice. The incitement is that aspect of vocational experience that makes the vocational experience mine as beloved. Anointment is that essential dimension of vocational experience that opens my vocational experiences to others and the social world, such that my becoming being is tied to the becoming being of others. My vocation as going to myself is intertwined with the vocations of others going to themselves. Vocational justice is founded in anointment as the solidarity of beloveds. More specifically, vocational justice entails ensuring the conditions and the means for others to flourish. The fifth point concerns evidence. Unlike a task, a vocation is not open to objective ratification or verification in the way in which objects are. So we have to ask, is there a distinctive form, or are there distinctive forms of verification with respect to vocation? What is the relation of self-knowledge to vocation? Do we have to know what we are doing in order to become who we are? Do we have to be explicitly aware or self-reflective in our vocations in order to realize them? I mean, we do seem to want to know who we are or who we are to become, and we can't assume that this is nothing. So we have to ask, like the mystics in the Abrahamic tradition do in any case, is there a way that we can test it? Does it require a confessor or a mentor or a teacher or a guide? We can ask, is there an historical efficacy that might be a clue to the genuine experience, as it tends to be for the mystics when they refer to the necessity of this interpersonal dimension, but also to the historical efficacy of what they have experienced. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just looking at my time. I probably have like another 5 minutes. Is that right? Okay, so I'll try to name some of these other features that are more maybe negative experiences that are interesting that we could help discern. So these are just more a way of saying how can we discern, and this has to do with the that critical dimension of the heart, the discernment in relation to vocation. Let's say I could have a vocational experience in the negative. A negative vocational experience could be given as in the form of, I don't know what to do, or I don't have such a vocational experience. I think that still is testimony to it. So for example, here we'd have a negative experience founded in some kind of positive experience. So this would be like the norm, the violation of the norm that's experienced that presupposes the norm in order to experience some violation without knowing the norm explicitly. So even though temporally speaking, the violation of the norm might be sensed or recognized first, the positive givenness of the norm is foundational for that experience. In a similar manner, a vocation can be experienced in and through missing it, or not feeling quite right in what we're doing. And I may not know what to do directly, but there's a vague sense, So such a negative sense could mean that something is indeed there, but I can't find it. And I am troubled that nothing comes to me. I feel ill at ease because something should be there, but it's not, or the particular things that I'm doing and that I'm experiencing are not it. And this kind of experience could mean that there is a vocational dimension that I'm not getting it somehow. Or more positively, there's an experience of I need to be or I need to do otherwise, whether the issue of vocation itself is vague. It's the experience that something very profoundly should be there, but it's not. Or we might experience something like the tendency to fill our lives with a lot of little occupying tasks, but we also sense that these finite tasks are not equal to a vocation or vocations. And this would be the attempt to fill this void of an absolute ought with relative tasks that, of course, cannot fill it. It could be the fact that a vocational experience is dynamic and unfolding, and it's continuing to unfold in a dialogue or a negotiation of who I am to become. It could further mean that there are many vocations that are mine and could be mine that are not like abstract possibilities I pick out on a job fair, but that there's not just one level or dimension of who I am, but there are different levels, and that these can become more or less prominent depending on social, economic, interpersonal structures. Or it could be that our experience is always finite, and there are no definitive answers in these receptions or responses. Now, on another, okay, that would be like one set that I was mentioning. There could be another that, look, there's a negative as there's just nothing to be found. And we have to entertain this possibility as well. So, it's just because our parents always ask, what are you going to do? Or what are you going to be? And so we always think this, but quite frankly, there's nothing there. And that could be the reason for the negative. There might be another sense, I'll just, in a different tradition, like in Zen Buddhism, where there'd be a void. I'll just cite Dogen here. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as bodies and minds of others, drop away. No trace of realization remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. Now, That's another possibility, but that's not a vocational experience, and it doesn't fit, but that would be another possibility we'd have to entertain. And then finally, I think for a negative experience, I think, and I always say this, Camus is probably the best figure for saying this. There's no ground. And that doesn't mean that there's a ground that's absent. There's just no ground. That's why suicide is the most fundamental philosophical issue. And for him, because it presupposes a ground. So hope presupposes a ground, but despair does too, the ground that's not there. And so suicide would just appeal to a ground that's not there. That's not the case. So we'd have to say, well, the only way you could really avoid a negative experience, so if you have a negative experience that you don't feel anything, whatever, it would either have to be like the Zen Buddhist one, I think, or the very challenging radical existentialist position of Camus of absurdity. There's no ground, and any attempt to fill in a ground is an attempt to place something that is not there. Outside of that, then we're in a vocational structure, and then it's a matter of trying to work out kinds of evidence that belong to the order of the heart, not necessarily a rationalism. So I think I'm on time. I'll end right there, and welcome whatever questions or comments you might have.